So hopefully that should be through, and then she can join that way. Thank you. Ah, there she is.
We did it.
We did it.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened there.
No, that was me. I'm sure that was me. I apologize. Well, hi, how are you?
I'm so good. How are you?
I'm great.
So good to see you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you again. So we will just get going. Everything is sort of up and running. So at least I had the chance to hit all the buttons I needed to hit. So we will just get, now that you're here, we'll get going. So hello, everybody, and welcome to this. This is the 7th installment of Must Read TV, the Skylark Bookshop Virtual Author Series. My name is Alex George, and I'm the owner of Skylark Bookshop, which is an independent bookstore located in downtown Columbia, Missouri. When my last novel was published back in May, which was like about 1 million years ago, we were all under lockdown. And, oh, look at you. Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you. And my book tour and other events were all cancelled. But tonight's guest, Christina Baker Kline, very kindly agreed to interview me for a website called A Mighty Blaze, whose co-founder, Caroline Levitt, is actually, I'm going to be talking to tomorrow night. And it was particularly kind of Christina to do this because she had already read the book once. Her lovely blurb actually appears on the cover. And so, poor woman, she had to read the thing again to ask me questions about it. And it was a wonderful act of generosity and also self-sacrifice. And I'm very pleased to return the favor this evening. Christina's new novel, The Exiles, stormed into the New York Times bestseller list instantly on publication. It is also a USA Today and Indie Next bestseller and has received multiple rave reviews. Kirkus gave it a starred review and called it monumental. And a starred review from Kirkus is a rare and wonderful thing.
That's true.
They tell me. I mean, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know.
They're brutal. That can be very hard.
Christina is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including Orphaned Train and A Piece of the World, and she has been published in 40 different countries. Her novels have received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among other prizes. And her books have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, as schools as one book, one read selections. Her essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in publications such as the New York Times and the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, Lit Hub, Psychology Today, and Salon. She appeared at the Unbound Book Festival in 2018 and spends more time than is strictly fair in Maine. I realize I'm editorializing a little bit here. I apologize.
I like that. No, it's good.
I'm stuck in Missouri and I wish I were where you were, but oh well. If you enjoy this evening's conversation, please do help Skylark out in these difficult times and purchase a copy of Christina's book from us. Each book comes with one of these, which is a Skyku that Christina wrote, and you'll see it is signed. And this is unique to people who buy the book from Skylark. And these are collector's items. And, so please buy from us. And if you are there, we have a limited number, but if you get in there early, you will get one of those. The best way of doing that is to drop us a line at mail@skylarkbookshop.com. Or call us, but please call us tomorrow morning, not tonight, because I'm not going to pick up the phone, 573-777-6990, and we will take care of that for you. If you have a question for Christina, please write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, then you can type a comment there in the comment section. All right, business. So Christina, this book, it's just drop dead gorgeous. I've read it twice and I loved it both times. And I wonder if we could begin just by, could you give us a sort of what we would call the elevator pitch and just give a very broad overview of the story that you've told here?
Yes. Okay. So that's a great beginning. A lot of times in these conversations, we kind of get going for 20 minutes and then I realize nobody has any idea what the story's about. So that's
Right.
perfect. Okay, so the big picture is that The Exiles is the story. Here you can see on the cover, there's the convict ship. The Exiles is the story of the convict women who transformed Australia and the Aboriginal people whose way of life was destroyed when specifically British colonists landed on their shores. That's a very sort of large description of the novel, but I think it's accurate in that I was trying to tell a kind of sweeping story about the founding of Australia, which is a very complicated word, but about the people who came after many thousands of years. There had been people there. Many of these people were brought against their will, and it all happened essentially because America eventually rejected the convicts from Britain and they had nowhere else to send them. So that was how it began.
Great. So would you read just a tiny bit for us, just to give us a sense of the lovely language, and that would be wonderful.
Yes, I would be more than happy to do that. So I was thinking that the character who brings you into the convict story is named Evangeline, and she's sort of a stand-in for the reader because she is herself a reader. She's the daughter of a vicar, and she's educated, but she's not wealthy. Her father dies and she has nowhere to go. She becomes a governess. She becomes pregnant because she has an ill-advised affair with a young man in the household. And then she's accused of stealing a ring, in part just to get rid of her. And so this is a moment, it's only 1 minute. I'm going to read you 1 minute because I know reading is very whatever. But this is a moment when she has a sort of realization that everything is changing. And so here she is. She's been accused of stealing this ring. She's in the carriage on the way to Newgate Prison. And she's just sitting next to a constable. And here's what happens. So now, sitting in the drafty carriage, she moved her shackled wrists to the left side of her body and rubbed the place beneath her petticoat where she tucked the monogrammed handkerchief. With the fingers of one hand, she traced its faint outline, imagining she could feel the thread of Cecil's initials interwoven with the family crest, a lion, serpent, and crown. It was all she would ever have of him, except, apparently, for the child growing inside her. The carriage made its way west toward the river. No one spoke in the chilly compartment. Without realizing what she was doing, Evangeline inched closer to the solid warmth of the constable next to her. Glancing down, he curled his lip and shifted toward the window, widening the space between them. Evangeline felt a prickle of shock. She had never in her life experienced a man's revulsion. She'd taken for granted the small gifts of kindness and solicitude that came her way. The butcher who gave her choice cuts of meat, the baker who saved her the last loaf. Suddenly it dawned on her. She was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible. All right, so that's that one part. But she's on her way to sort of Hades, which is Newgate Prison. You literally descend into the depths, and her whole life is about to change. And it's this moment in the book when, you realize you're entering this different world.
Yeah, because she has had this cloistered, not exactly impoverished, but not especially well off upbringing, and she learns Latin and Shakespeare and all of these things. And yes, that moment, that realization is, she's on the beginning of a journey, and it's not going to end anywhere. It's not going to end well. It's such a great moment. So when I think of you and I think of your books, I always just think of storytelling and story, and I really wanted to begin there. Um, and I just wanted to start by asking you, so what in your mind makes a good story?
I think there has to be an element of surprise. I think there has to be something that catches you off guard. Certainly true in your book. We can talk more about that. But there are, I think it's important that you have really interesting characters who, you know, are not interesting because they're necessarily quirky or different. Some are, or different than perhaps. I mean, look, we're all different, right? So I think it's about discovering what is at a deep level interesting about people. That's what it is. It's kind of, I mean, I always tell my students, it's about the curiosity that you have about other people, essentially, that informs the writing process. Because if you're a novelist, you have to really be curious about what's under the top level of someone. You know, we all know you run into someone every day or you know, every week for your life, and you may not scratch the surface of who they are. There might be this hugely rich mine underneath that we're polite. We don't delve too deeply. We don't ask inappropriate questions, perhaps. But that's what a novel does. It asks the inappropriate questions. It delves underneath the surface. So Olive Kintridge, for example, by Elizabeth Strout, or Elena Ferrante's novels about these characters who are on the surface, you know, you look at them and you say, these are recognizable characters, right? But underneath, you have this whole wellspring of depth and diversity and complication. And that's what it is to write a novel. And so to me, a successful novel plumbs those depths and shows you, even when we pass each other on the street and look like we're normal to each other, that we all have these really interesting complications. And so for a novel like The Exiles, where they're sent on this extreme voyage, right? It's about figuring out what resources these characters have themselves, what superpowers they have to stay alive, if they have them or don't. Some do and some don't, right? And so part of what I wanted to do in this novel is to show the arbitrariness, on the one hand, of life and death in a situation like that. And on the other hand, to show that if you do have certain superpowers, you can survive and even thrive. And that was a real gift of the book for me. It was like discovering how my characters could ignite if they had the right circumstances.
Right. That's so interesting. Yeah. Throw them off a cliff and then see whether they're going to fly or not. So that's really interesting. Well, and I know that when you wrote to your editor at some point during this process and said how excited you were to be telling the story of a journey again. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and is there for you a certain magic? I mean, people often talk about arcs of novels and they will send your character on a journey, but you know, you sent your characters on a literal journey, about the biggest and longest and hardest journey imaginable. So is there something about journeys in particular that interests you as a subject?
It's not that they interest me as a subject as much as there's so much drama built into a journey. I saw a number of years ago, I think it was right before I wrote Orphan Train, I saw an interview with James Cameron, the film director, who did Titanic and you know, all these. And he was on Charlie Rose. And so the two of them were talking. And it was random that I watched this because I don't normally watch Charlie Rose. I don't know what I was doing. But so Charlie Rose was sort of breaking down, why did Titanic succeed on the level it succeeded? What is it about that movie what was it about that movie in particular that took off, and how would you analyze it? And James Cameron said, here's the secret. You have to send your characters on a journey. And you have to put them in conflict with each other. And you have to up the stakes at every opportunity. And then you have to make it, and this was the line that really got me, you have to make it excruciating somehow. Isn't that crazy? So I thought, okay, I've never done that in a novel. This was before Orphan Train, as I said. I've never done that in a novel. I'm going to do that. I'm going to try that.
Right.
What does it mean to make it excruciating? What it means is that in every scene, you're upping the stakes for your characters, and that they're always in conflict. They're always coming up against something bigger than themselves. And so in Orphan Train, it was natural in some ways, in that you turn up the screws, and the screws are that these children are alone in the world and they have to function and they don't know how to survive, right? And in the Exiles, it is that these people are thrust into the ocean for 4 to 6 months, and they have to then they end up on a new continent. They will never return to their homeland. And how do they survive that? That's what the drama is. And it's a big drama. So the book that I did in between was proving something different to myself, which was, can I have characters in a room to whom nothing happens, to have no drama, nothing, there's no story, there's no plot, and can I make it interesting? That was my dilemma with Piece of the World. Right, and, you know, with Piece of the World, it was so hard because every moment of drama I had to manufacture myself, because there they are. And their drama is small, but you want to make the small drama seem monumental, right? Like when you're dealing with emotion, as you did in Paris Hours, like when you're dealing with emotion and characters' strong feelings, you can actually ratchet that up to make it very large. In the Exiles and in Orphan Train, there are strong emotions, but more importantly, and what does half the work for you, is that the story is so big that it carries, you're just swept along by it. So as you know, Alex, these are very different paradigms, right? Of the like internal conflict and then this external. And there are complications and difficulties with both, but I was sort of relieved after this claustrophobic story that I wrote about Piece of the World, about this woman who lives in her house, and Andrew Wyeth comes in and he's very charismatic and it's exciting, but ultimately it's all just about her, to this much bigger canvas, which was kind of exciting to tell the story about.
Yeah, I'm sure. And when we talked in May, because I'm curious as to how, it was such a big shift between the two books, and I'm always curious, and we were talking before and you were asking me about what I'm writing now, and I gave you a rather sad answer, how you go about finding the subject matter and then settling on it. And when we talked in May, I think you and we actually talked about spidey sense, and you get this tingling. And then I didn't realize that you actually talk about spidey sense.
I think it might have been, was it inspired by you? No, maybe I did that before.
I don't know. Anyway, but so what, I wonder if you talk a bit more about spidey sense, and then what was it about so how did you come across this story of the going to Australia, and why did you go, that's the one I'm going to spend the next few years of my life sort of telling this story?
It's always so hard to know, but I've learned in my old age that it has to be a big idea, because for me at least, I mean, I did an event with John Grisham the other night. He writes 2 books a year, so this is not his problem. But my problem is that I write a book every 3 years or so, and it really needs to be big enough and interesting enough that it is worth all of that work, because it's so much work to write a novel. And I feel like it has to be a really big tingle. Like, what is exciting me? What do I think people are going to love and be interested in? Like, what is a story that I want to jump into? And with the Exiles, I definitely had that feeling. But, you know, here's the other thing, and I'm sure you feel this way, Alex. You don't always know what your motivations are exactly. They're not always conscious. And so sometimes it's not, like with the Paris Hours, for example. Well, okay, I'm going to step back and just ask you this question in the middle of our question. But like with the Paris Hours, did it come to you all at once, or was it bits and pieces?
It was, I mean, the general idea came to me at once, but I very much constructed it a piece at a time. I did not know at the beginning what on earth I was doing, and I just sort of felt my way into it.
Yeah.
So, you know, I knew that I was going to set it over the course of one day. I knew there were going to be multiple perspectives, but and what some of the characters were, but that was pretty much it. And so I okay, I'm not going to let you do that though, Christina, because this is
No, wait, I just have to ask
I'm asking you. People want to hear about me. They want to hear about you.
We're going to, but I just want to ask you, because I thought a little bit, I didn't say this in May when we talked, so I'm going to say it now, but it's set over the course of one day and it's multiple perspectives. Did you think of Mrs. Dalloway at all?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, of course, right? Virginia
and I almost wrote one of those sort of listy type articles for somebody about novels set over the course of one day.
Right.
You know, Mrs. Dalloway and Ulysses and so on and so forth. So, but yeah, never got around to it. But yes, I mean, I was certainly thinking about that and about what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I just read Colette for the first time. Believe it or not, I'd never read Colette. And I was thinking of your novel a little bit in terms of like setting and place and the lushness of it and the time period. And I wondered if you had read.
I haven't. And the book about Paris I've just read was Giovanni's Room by Baldwin, which I don't know how I didn't read that when I was in my 20s, but there you are, I read it now, and it was just wonderful, and just vicious and awful, and just by the end it was like, oh God, it was so awfully true, and that was why it was so brilliant. But do
you feel like you would have done anything different if you'd read it before you wrote the book? Do you feel like you would have done anything different with the Paris Hours if you'd read it first?
No.
I mean, it's so interesting, the question of influence in a way, you know?
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Because I mean, you know, I would never presume there's such different books and different places and different. No, I don't think so. But I certainly enjoyed it enormously. Anyway, can we please talk about your book? You're very sweet, but I want to talk about. I have lots and lots of questions. Although I was so one question I did have was about some of the similarities between our books. Is that they are both told from multiple perspectives. And they also have, what's particularly interesting to me, a mixture of fictional characters and real characters.
That's right, absolutely.
So you mentioned Evangeline, and then there's also Hazel from Scotland, who was sent out by her mother into the streets of Glasgow, I think, to pick pockets, and she's caught. And so both of these women that's why they're sent to Australia for their crimes. And so those two characters are fictional, but you also included as a sort of the third female character, a young Aboriginal girl, Mathina. Did I pronounce that right? Is that?
That's the way I pronounce it too. Okay. And the reader did, who's Australian.
Oh, she did. Okay. And didn't you just win an award for that, by the way, the audiobook?
I am proud to say that I found this amazing woman, Caroline Lee, who has done all of Leah Moriarty's books and Kate Morton.
Oh, okay.
She's wonderful. And she just won, an audiophile earphones award for narrating The Exiles, which is super exciting. And the feedback on the audiobook is so amazing. People love it. And I love that. I mean, she does all the voices and she's incredibly charismatic. And it's a wonderful audiobook. So that's exciting. And
Libro FM, people, that's where you need to get your audiobooks from.
What's that?
Libro FM.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Libro FM. Totally.
Yeah. So, well, and I did have another question about audiobooks a bit later, but I wanted to talk about Mathina because she is based on a real person. So she was the daughter or granddaughter of a tribal leader.
He was daughter of a chieftain.
Right, of a chieftain, thank you. And was taken away by the governor of the island. Van Diemen was that. And so did you think, so my first question, multiple parts to this, when you were writing her story, were you thinking in the same way or in a different way than when you were telling the story of the characters that you were sort of creating from whole cloth and that you were making up?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying that the book began because I read an article in the New York Times about these convict women. It was actually an article. Lisa Belkin was a columnist back. She's still a wonderful writer, but she's no longer a New York Times editor, columnist. And she had a column called Motherload, and she wrote about issues of interest to women with children. And I was a woman with children at the time, youngish children at the time. And I read this column that was unusual because she usually wrote about contemporary things, but it was about the convict women and their children on the boats, on the ships to Australia, what it was like. And when I read it, I immediately thought, this is what I want to write about. This is an amazing story. It took me a long time to do it because that was actually around the time of orphan trade. I had all these other things going on, but I thought I would write about the convict women, and I only realized belatedly that it's because I taught in a women's prison. I wrote a book about feminism. I went to Australia on a Rotary Fellowship in my 20s. There were all these things that pulled together to make me interested in that story. You know, again, influence is so interesting. Like, I immediately had the spidey tingle that I wanted to write the story, but I didn't know why until I had written the story, and then I realized the book. And then I realized, oh, actually all these different things came together. But when I went to Australia to do research, when I went to what is now Tasmania, was called Van Diemen's Land when my novel takes place in the 1840s and 50s, I realized that it would be irresponsible not to address the story of what happened to the Aboriginal people, because it was at exactly the same time period that they were essentially being, I mean, there's a question of whether what happened to the Aboriginal people in Tasmania was genocide. There's a debate about that. But truth is, in the early 1800s, there were thousands of Aboriginal people. And by 1870, there were 0 full-blooded Aboriginal people in Tasmania. And they had fought what was called the Black War, which was actually, was it war? Was it terrorism? I'm not sure. Or was it, you know, was it, what happened was the white people came in with literally millions of sheep, and they penned up all the hunting grounds of the Aboriginal people. I mean, it's not that dissimilar from our own American story. But anyway, there was this conflict, and then the survivors of that were shunted off to this island, Flinders Island, right off the coast of Tasmania, between Australia and Tasmania, which are the same, they're both Australia. This island, Flinders Island, was essentially an open-air concentration camp for Aboriginal people, and they were treated badly there. But my character, who's a real person, Mathina, was born there. And she was the daughter of a chieftain. She was treated pretty well. And she never thought of it as a bad place. You know, she was born and raised there. And one day the governor of Tasmania showed up with his wife. It was Sir John Franklin, who became famous later as an Arctic explorer. And in fact, eventually disappeared in the Arctic with his entire crew. He was he failed upwards as an Arctic explorer. He was knighted by the Queen. And his wife, Lady Jane, who was very ambitious. And they came in and they saw this beautiful girl dancing, speaking English. And they said, let's do this experiment. Let's see if we can turn her into a lady. So they took her back to the governor's mansion, and they taught her French, and they taught, you know, and they had her taught how to dance and all of this. And then a few years later, they were called back to London, and they abandoned her. And she no longer had a real identity, and it was a very hard life. So I learned about the story of Mathina when I was in Tasmania, and I realized I can't not tell this story. I understand that it's a difficult story to tell for someone like me. I'm not Australian. I'm not Tasmanian, and I'm not an Aboriginal person. I have little claim to it. So I told it in the third person, and I also consulted with really important people who knew the stories, and Aboriginal historians who are themselves descended from Aboriginal people, and a historian of Tasmanian history who's written all these books, Alison Alexander, Dr. Gregory Lehman, all these people. And that was really important to me to get the details right. But, you know, it's a risk, but I also felt like I couldn't not tell that story, and that it was definitely part of the story.
I mean, and it's part of the, I mean, it's some of the most memorable parts of the book, and I say that not in a good way, unfortunately, are those scenes, and sort of the scenes where she sort of trotted out like a pet, and for inspection, and being asked to perform these, I mean, literal party tricks, and then the guests refer to her as it. And it's
I mean, you know, all of that is from the record. So like the biographies of the Franklins and the historical record about Mathina, like I literally quoted, you know, from those. It's a tough story.
Oh, it's horrific. And, you know, this Governor Franklin, I mean, he's like this sort of malicious Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady, and this glorified.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, I like that.
It was just,
and you know, and he saw himself as entirely benevolent, and you can see as you're reading it that they all see themselves as entirely benevolent, and they're just not. What I love though about the story that I told is that the class situation was so complicated because Mathina was from an upper class. Her accent was perfect. She spoke French. She read literature. She, you know, she knew she wore beautiful clothes. And the convict maids who came in were from the lowest rungs of the social ladder, and they, you know, they didn't have any of those benefits, and they were poor, and they weren't treated well. So it was this fascinating sort of combination for the book that I think really gives it a lot of interest to me. I like.
Yeah, it added an entirely new dimension to the thing, and I mean, I think it worked. I think it worked brilliantly. Yeah, but wow, it was a shocker, for sure. So and it is interesting that, you know, Mathina is a real person, and so I just wanted to touch on a question that sort of historical novelists I know get asked the whole time, about that tension that we all have to live with between wanting to tell the story that we want to tell, and honoring the facts as they exist.
Yeah.
And I think that all novelists sort of exist on this spectrum of total indifference to any of that stuff, to an almost obsessive compulsive desire to get every last detail right.
Yeah.
And I was just curious as to where you fall in that, where you think that you fall.
Yeah. It's yeah, that's such a huge question, and I actually want to know what you think about you. We'll get to that in a second. But I did an event with Lily King the other night, who I adore. And we had been on a panel together last year, I guess, or maybe a year and a half ago. And it was, let's see, we were talking about, you know, her writing about Margaret Mead in Euphoria, and my research for Orphan Trade, or for Peace of the World, whatever, I can't remember. And she was saying, like, I never met a fact that I didn't jettison if I didn't like it. Like, I never feel any need. She said, I didn't travel. I wasn't interested in that. If something happened in her life that didn't fit my story, I didn't care. I was not going to do it. And I just did what I wanted. And I thought, and I said to her in this event, like, you're my idol. I aspire to that. I would like to do that. I'm a little too ridiculous about it. Like, my novels are factually accurate pretty much. I mean, Mathina's story. So Mathina was 5 in real life when she was taken in by the governor and his wife. And I made her 8 because I wanted her consciousness to be a little bit more developed. I wanted, because even though it's not first person, it's third person, but you're seeing it through her eyes. I wanted her to be able to observe in a way that she wouldn't have been able to as a 5-year-old. And so that was the big change I made. other than that, the facts of the story are pretty accurate.
Right.
So I had a sort of conundrum that I'll just mention quickly, which is that at the end, do we need to end? What time is it? I'm looking at my time. Oh, yeah.
We're good.
Okay.
We got some.
Okay. And do we need to stop for questions? I don't know if there are.
Oh yeah, we've got questions too, but this is,
Okay.
I want to hear this. So.
Yeah. Okay. So Mathina, her real story was super tragic and ended when she was 17. And I'll just say, this is not a surprise, because if you look online, you'll find this real true life story, which is that when she was 17, she died. She drowned. And they don't know if it was suicide or murder, or if she'd been in a sort of drunken state because she had taken to alcohol at that point. I didn't want to go all that way. And also my novel ended way before that. So, I mean, my story. So I did what I did in Piece of the World, which is that in that novel, Christina Olson, who's the muse for Andrew Wyeth, real life, the last 20 years of her life are really hard. She's disabled, lives in poverty. She ends in sort of squalor and poverty. And I thought, I want to end on a moment of connection. So I ended when Andrew Wyeth shows her the painting, Christina's World, that was her, sort of an idealized version of her. And she recognizes that he has seen her for who she really is. And that was a high point at the end of that book. And it's not giving anything away to say that, because on the very first page, I talk about that. But in this novel, I did the same thing with Mathina. I ended on a high point, a moment of connection with another character whom she had befriended. And you kind of know that things are gonna maybe not end up the best for her, but you don't experience that with her. This novel, there's a lot of stuff in it that's pretty hard. And I just wanted to have these moments that were very profoundly connective between characters.
That's so interesting, because I'm very, very smart, because what you're doing is you're kind of you're having your cake and eat it, because you're staying true to those facts, but you're still being able to edit and sort of sculpt without just by an act of omission. And
that's a great way of putting it, that you just stop at a certain point. It's sort of that question, Alex, and I know you've dealt with this too, but like, how do you shape the beginning and end of your story? When do you start and when do you end? Because that is a real question for a novelist about creating the whole arc of your story.
Yeah. Well,
and what about you with this question?
What
about you with this question about fealty to facts versus?
So I mean, let's start by stipulating that we all want to be Lily King in some way, shape, and then her idea about just not caring. I mean, what I did was, so of my 4 characters, 1 of them was real and 3 of them were made up. And up until quite late on in the process, I used the real character's real name. Until I stuck, again, very close to the facts, and where I could, I would use language and conversations that had been sort of recorded. But by the end, the story had developed in such a way that it was no longer, I couldn't in all good conscience represent that this was the story of this person. So what I did, rather to my editor's frustration, because it was so late on in the process, is I changed her name. And I think because in Euphoria, the main character isn't called Margaret Mead.
That's right.
Yeah, so when you change the name, you suddenly have this license to then go wild, and so the character is very much based on the person, but it wasn't actually her. Whereas you didn't allow yourself to do that because you kept her name, and so you did. So
it makes me think maybe I should have.
No, I don't change that. We're a little late now, but it was the story went in such a way that I couldn't in all conscience leave the name as it was. So that was kind of how.
Who was it in real life?
So Proust's real maid was called Celeste Alby, and that was for the first several years and drafts. That was the character's name was Celeste, and then we changed it and called her something else because I took certain unconscionable liberties with established records. So I thought, well, she can't sue me from beyond the grave, but I wouldn't be able to go to sleep at night. So that was why I changed it. So there's a wonderful quote which I often sort of bring up during these conversations, which is by E.L. Doctorow, and you've probably heard this. And he said, no, not the one about the headlights. No, there's another one.
I love the headlights. Okay,
no, that's a really good. No, this is one specifically on the point. And he says, well, a historian will tell you what happened, and a novelist will tell you what it felt like. And I've always enjoyed that. And so my question to follow up on that is, what do you think fiction set in the past can do that nonfiction, like a history book, cannot?
I feel like this is a setup because I have this perfect quote also.
Well.
So when I was working on this novel, I read an article called Just the Facts, Ma'am by Jill Lepore in the New Yorker. Jill Lepore is phenomenal.
Anything she writes, I will read.
Oh, so brilliant. She's so brilliant. So she said, it was about writing about the past. And she said, fiction does what history doesn't, but should.
Oh, that's good.
To tell the story of ordinary men. And then she went on to say, and who are these ordinary men? Well, most of them are women. So that was just such a great quote because it made me realize, my God, that's exactly sort of what I've been doing without quite putting a finger on it, realizing it is, fiction does what history doesn't but should, which is to tell the story of ordinary people, right? And that so many of those are women because their stories haven't been told. Because who tells history? Conquerors. Conquerors normally do not include females, the poor, indigenous people, right? Immigrants. So those people have been excluded from the historical record in a concrete way. And so what are we all trying to do? What is this whole BLM fiction, nonfiction movement about? From Isabel Wilkerson to, there are so many writers who are trying to tell a story that has not been part of the historical record. And it is the story of the underclass and of women. And that's what I'm really interested in these days.
There was a great book published earlier this year called You Never Forget Your First, which is the first biography of George Washington written by a woman. And she talks about all of the men who have written these biographies. I can't remember what she calls them, but like the thigh men, I think she calls them, because they keep going on about the size of George Washington's thighs. And she's having none of it. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book and a real breath of fresh air. And again, just like taking the narrative away from the people who have always been telling the story.
Yeah. And I think people are actually hungry for the story of that haven't been told. I mean, if you look at fiction that's being published today and that's igniting, it's often those stories that we're like, okay, we know what the history is that we've been taught. Now we want to know the story behind that. And it feels like that's what's going on, a lot of what's going on.
For sure. Well, we've got questions, but I have one more question that I want to ask before we get on questions, and it's about villains. There are lots of villains here. Now, ostensibly, you might say that Evangeline and Hazel are the villains because they were convicted of a crime. But as you mentioned, I mean, the British stole an entire country from the Aboriginals, and so they are sort of far more villainous. And pretty much every Englishman, with one honourable exception, that we meet are fairly dastardly, twiddling their moustaches. But there's one in particular, and I'm talking about Buck, who is just magnificently horrible and awful, and I loved, you know, there's something about reading about a really terrible person that as a reader is incredibly satisfying. There's not one redeeming feature, and it's just somebody that you can love to hate. And the last time I read somebody like this was, I know that you're talking to Anne Patchett tomorrow night. The mother-in-law in the Dutch house was a similar kind of just utterly awful person. It's like, anyway, and my question is it more fun to write villains than to write heroes?
There's this one moment where Hazel, in my book, Hazel is, so it's Evangeline, Hazel, and then are the three main characters. And Hazel's this scrappy 16-year-old girl. She grows up a little bit in the book, but she's a midwife, and she sort of takes no guff from anyone, let's just say. And she's in conflict with this man, and she says sort of to herself, you know, he had a mother and he had a family, and he probably has a story, but I'm just not that interested in it because this is how he manifests. You know, Buck was sort of, for me, a stand-in for a lot of those brutal sailors and soldiers and guards who they no doubt had humanity, but they did not exhibit it to the female prisoners they were in charge of. And look, this extends today to, you know, many people. Like you read people's real, it was what we were saying earlier about empathy. You read their stories and you understand that they're human, and they have great, you know, they have pasts that are complicated. But when you take advantage of women and people of color and poor people and show your power over them, it's not, the rest of it goes away. And you know what, Alex, I was thinking about when I was writing this book, it's been in the turmoil of this administration. I mean, not to get political, I'm not going to, but of so many instances of unfair police action and people being stereotyped and typecast. And for me, a lot of the issues in the Exiles, even though it took place in the 1840s and 1850s, is really about now. It's about what place women have in society, what place Native people have, African Americans in our world. In some ways, the Aboriginal people are a combination of our Native Americans and the African Americans. They were discriminated against in similar ways. I mean,
there are certainly echoes in those scenes I talked about before, about when Mathina went to these parties of, you know, I could imagine similar conversations happening at a similar sort of time in the States where, yeah, so I can, it was all there. But isn't that what historical fiction, good historical fiction
is? It is. I think it is. Yeah, it's about how do you, yeah, you know, completely. And yours as well. It's like, how do you bring to life an era in a way that also sheds light on our current era? And I think that's I think if it, in my view, if historical fiction or even speculative fiction like The Handmaid's Tale, right?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Not exactly historical, but it is sort of, right? It's speculative, it's a different world, and it gives us insight into the world today. That's what I like. That's what I'm interested in reading about. I like that.
So we had a question from Craig in Derry in New Hampshire. Can you talk a bit about your writing routine, and both in terms of day-to-day practice and your approach in terms of, do you get out a first draft or do you revise along the way? And then he also wanted to know how and when you use readers.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there, but maybe you could sort of
Yeah.
pick?
No, just let's see. So when I'm working on a novel, I try to do 4 pages a day or 20 pages. I try to do 20 pages a week. And ideally that would be 4 pages a day, 5 days a week, but it's not always like that. And by the way, I'm not doing that right now. So I'm in the middle of all this. And I don't do it all the time, but when I'm doing it, that's what I try to do. And it doesn't always work.
So you do pages rather than the word count?
Yeah, because I don't do word count because I write longhand. I don't write on a laptop. I know. I've done events with people for the past week or 2 weeks, and a bunch of them write longhand. Not all of them, but a bunch of them do. Like Kristen Hanna writes longhand. Yeah. And so I write longhand. I have college rules. Do I have any? I have my over there. I was going to show you, but with a certain pen that I love, and I really have to write 20 pages a week. So remember that long ago political slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." It was James Carville back in the day, long ago. I have a little post-it above my desk that said, "It's the writing, stupid," meaning nothing else matters when I'm working, when I'm trying to write a novel. It's the only thing that matters ultimately, because life is busy. We're doing all kinds of stuff all the time, and it would be super easy not to even write, right? I mean, so ultimately you have to give the writing precedence over everything and be cutthroat about it. And that's what's so hard, I find. That's what's so hard. So if I don't write 4 pages a day, it means I have a bottleneck like Lucy with the factory on the conveyor belt. And I force myself. I have to write 8 pages another day or whatever. So I just have to do the 20 pages a week. And when I'm in it, that's what I have to do to get a rough draft out.
Do you have a particular time of day that you write, or is it just whenever you can fit it in?
I am best around like 11. So I start in the morning, but it takes a little while to get going sometimes. And I find like 11 to 2 is great. But you know what I've learned is that there are sneaky ways to make yourself do this that are very useful. Like, for example, now with COVID, it's all changed, but I have an apartment in New York City. I write on the subway. I write at 5 p.m. I'll get at 5:30. I'll have a glass of wine on the counter and write another 2 pages. I mean, if I can just squeeze in extra writing time like that feels like a bonus, then it's very exciting. And so I set aside the time, which is often hard because writing for me is very hard. But then there are other times when it feels easy, and it's often when I'm not expecting much of myself. And so on a subway, for example, I might write a scene that's solely dialogue, or I might write a scene that is description of a certain thing that I wouldn't have otherwise taken the time to do. And in Orphan Train in particular, I was thinking about this the other day, a lot of the contemplative things, you know how people do like posters of your quotes? Anyway, so like and the things that people quote, like on Goodreads, are often the things that I wrote when I wasn't making myself write. They were in the other moments when I was thinking about the bigger picture of the book.
That's fascinating for 2 reasons. First of all, as a fact, that's interesting, but it's also interesting to me that you can remember where you were when you wrote a particular thing.
Well, I just know that some of the insights I had about like foster care, about being alone, about being on a train. I remember sitting at my kitchen counter with a glass of wine at 5:30 and music, like playing music, which I normally don't do when I write in the morning. Like I don't normally do that. Do you? I don't do it at all. And it feels distracting.
I wish I could write with music, but I'm like
but this is my point about rules, that you like have to break the rules too, because in the afternoon, if I have, say, a song that conjures something, I just say, okay, I'm going to write now, but I'm going to write toward the novel. I don't know if it will end up in it, but I'm going to write. And those things can be really like, So here's just the big picture answer to that question is I have learned that the goal is to capture lightning in a bottle. And the way to do that is to catch yourself off guard, and it's to write freely in the first draft. I used to write slowly and carefully and not revise very much. Now I write fast and messy, not that fast. I mean, I wish I were faster, but I write messy, and I write 3 different ways into a scene, and then I have to come back and edit it, and it's a mess. But it feels like there's more stuff in there that's actually good and interesting if I can get it on the page.
Fascinating. I wish I could do that.
What do you do?
I go incredibly slowly and go back, and I'm forever editing as I go. And I wish I'd love to try and just like get out a first draft in 3 months and then go back. But yeah, it's just, I mean, we're all different. And that's one of the pernicious things about writing advice, because everyone always says, well, what's your best? And it's a silly question, because whatever works for you or what works for me most likely won't work for the next person, because everyone.
But I also say, Alex, that part of it is leaving yourself open to another. Like as I said, I was slow and careful, and then I kind of shifted a little bit, and this is uglier and takes longer, but it feels like it ultimately has more energy in it. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm deluding myself.
Well, maybe, you know, we sell these, here comes a sort of apologies everybody for the plug here, but we sell these really nice notebooks and pencils in the shop, and I use them now in a way I didn't before, but maybe I'll actually start writing an actual book with them rather than just
maybe you just see how that goes.
May release something up here, so who knows. All right, well, we're slightly over. Can we go a couple more minutes?
Yeah, I can, but
okay, so I'll just ask one last question then, which is just about, I mean, about books, of course. So what books have you read this year that you would like to tell everyone about, that you just loved?
Well, you have to tell me too. I'm going to go get my book. 1 second. I'm going to show you the book. I read all the time, and I've been reading. First of all, your amazing book.
Oh.
But I feel like I've already talked about that a lot. So I'm going to tell you another book that has nothing to do with the books of my, speakers, co-speakers, which are fantastic. And it goes without saying, I've been advertising them all night and love them. But this book, Miriam, I don't know if you read it. All My Peers.
I haven't read it, but we've sold a ton of them. Yeah.
I love this book. I had no expectations. I didn't know what it was. I'm in a writers reading group of 6 writers, and someone suggested it. We read it. And so Miriam Tours, I don't remember how to pronounce her name. She is Canadian. She wrote a book called Women Talking that was a bigger hit, maybe. But this book is so profound and so deep and meaningful. And the minute I finished it, I thought I could read this again right now. It's about 2 sisters, one of whom is suicidal, and the other is the narrator. And it's about the question of sort of what's going to actually happen, but also about who they are, what their relationship is. And it's just so fresh and original. Okay, that's my book. What about you?
Well, I mean, I sort of like you. I mean, I read a ton, and there are so many. The one book that isn't coming out, and I know it's annoying when people do this, not coming out until December, but it's called Wintering by Catherine May, which just blew me away, and I'm desperate to read it again.
It's coming out next spring?
In December. It's coming out in December, and it's a non-fiction book, and it's about happiness, really, and how we and how when we winter, we hibernate in a way, and there's this sort of emotional hibernation that we do, and that's okay, and bad things happen, and it's not actually the end of the world, and it's just a totally different way of looking at life, and it was just beautifully written and just a real eye-opener, and I can't wait. It's like one of those books, I can't wait for it to come out so I can put it in people's hands. So
yeah, Oh, that's exciting. Isn't it so fun to have a book like that, that you, as a bookseller, that you love so much?
Yeah, there are many books like that, but I'm looking forward to that one for sure. Well, Christina, I'm sorry, we had lots of other questions which we didn't get to.
Oh, sorry too.
So
You'll
just
have to come, whoever has a question, if you come to another event, because now I think most of my events are probably not ticketed. I think, the next week, come and I'll answer them.
Okay, so Karen, I'm sorry that we didn't get to yours, and Jennifer and Crystal. Sorry. I think some of them we maybe answered a little bit, but thank you so much. This was such a joy. It's lovely to see you again.
It was so lovely. And can we ever have your festival in person again? I hope so.
Oh yeah, well, I hope so. I hope so. We're working on it. Maybe not this year, but soon. And I would love to have you back. So thank you. So just to wrap up, Christina, thank you very much. Thank everyone. Thank you all for watching. Again, please buy a copy of this wonderful book from us. 573-777-6990 or mail at skylarkbookshop.com. I nearly said the wrong email address.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. This was great. And hopefully see some of you tomorrow for Caroline Levitt. Thanks again.
Yeah,
bye. Take care.